look at the diagram in front of you, the tree diagram here, and start at the bottom. The symbol of the intestines represents the digestion of perceptual experience from reality, what you are assimilating into your system. The right and left kidneys represent the powers of thought and feeling, Hod and Netzach, respectively. This represents the activity of the psyche, the activity of your mind as you know it, if you are body-mind identified. What happens in Yesod changes all that. Now, remember that the layout that we're using here is the aspirational model of the tree without dot. We're using a model here of what we would like to be, not what we currently are. In the standard tree, where dot displaces the middle pillar, Yesod appears below Hod and Netzach, and Malkut is dangled out the bottom. But if you're a practitioner actively holding the view and training your mind, Yesod is not in that lower position, but above the powers of thought and feeling, above what in this diagram would be the right and left kidneys, and serves as the integration point for a series of changes in the Ruach, the center of the complex of the Ruach that is attributed with the mind's eye or the imagination, the power of the mind to create a vision of reality, both of itself and of everything else. And this is what is transmuted. So it's through Yesod and the aspirations of Yesod that perception becomes focused in the heart. And this raises the locus of our attention from mundane concerns, which are always displaced by conceptuality and always displaced by conceptual knowledge. Dot is conceptual knowledge. And raises the sparks that we have access to that are strewn throughout the habit field, and allows the heart to grow, and allows the heart to resonate and become more open and brighter. So this whole lower complex here, aspirationally, of the intestines, the kidneys, and the heart rising up, represents what we can do in our practice when we remember to do it. When we don't remember to do it, the middle pillar drops, and we go into the semi-comatose mechanical state of non-awareness. And the ironic thing is that that is so normal for a person that most people think that that is awareness. Most people think that that mechanical robotic state is when everything is fine and when reality is as it should be. And the entire culture pays credence to this, and the universities teach from that perspective, and human knowledge collectively is based on that point of view. So as a practitioner, you're breaking with that. And what you're doing is seeking to raise the point of integration, the Yesod, through the mind's eye into something beyond what it usually is. At the same time that what you have access to as the tools within your being are doing whatever they can to maintain the view, the extent to which you do it is met with a counterforce, and that counterforce is beyond your control. That counterforce is the force of blessing that comes from beyond you towards you. And there's the old adage that the practitioner takes one step forward and the divine takes two steps closer to meet them. And it's really true that the more you try, the more reality makes itself available for that attempt to take root. However, we know that the problem is dualizing these two vectors, one coming from below, one coming from above. And this feeds in, even in the esoteric sense, to all the dualistic separations that exist between God and creation, between microcosm and macrocosm, between self and other, between your mind and its own thoughts and perceptions. So, since the locus of our consciousness is generally seated in our brain, and that's really the apex of the change that takes place, when Yesod galvanizes its attention in the heart, it raises that point of view towards the brain to make the transmutation happen. The force of the divine that is drawn towards us to meet us is a new function for what would be brain-based activity, which for a human being is always tempered by dot, and allows that aspect of consciousness to give way to pure awareness. And that's what falls into the heart so that the heart can grow with it and expand its register and become more subtle, which is actually a simplifying force rather than making things more complex. It seems very complex when you're studying all this on the intellectual basis, but what the heart does is really very simple. It resonates, it glows, it's open. What else do you need? So look at the supernal triad in this tree, which represents the force that meets the practitioner in the heart. At the point of Keter, you have the root of transparency, that which resolves the separations and the reifications that your mind makes in the habit field. If you resolve them at their root, you resolve all of them at the same time. It's not like you take each klipa and hack through it with your contemplative hatchet and throw it in the fire and cook it and take it out one by one, moment by moment. You drive yourself crazy if that was it. No, you make the change at the root, and the change takes place across the board, depending on how deeply you can make it. So the root of transparency, existential transparency, the transparency of apparent states of being, happens at Keter. That transparency is inherently clear and unformed. That is its wisdom. The unformed brightness of that transparency is its clarity, which is known through states of bliss. Bliss in this sense is not referring to emotional bliss or the body-mind feeling really good, but the actual scintillating force of the inherent goodness of Ein Sof that comes through the transparency of Keter and is known through all things, is known through what would be states of being. That's why we call it existential transparency, the existential state of brightness and clarity. However, very important to understand that the bliss and the brightness and the clarity is not the point of contemplation. If we were just contemplating to achieve that state, which some systems do, we would be ignoring the mystery itself. Ein Sof is not merely the brilliance and the clarity and the bliss or the brightness. It is the ground of that brightness, which is equal with that brightness when it is realized, but is inherently not reducible to any bright state or clear state or bliss state. So it's through the transparency that this becomes realized. So when Keter is made transparent, its wisdom, its unformed bliss clarity can be recognized and expressed. If that is possible, the space of all states of being, the basic space of all worlds, all levels of consciousness, everything that is known and the knowing of it becomes bliss saturated, becomes saturated with the transparent clarity, because at the root of Keter, nothing is being restrained, nothing is being filtered out. There is an inherent, unbounded, unrestrained state of expression. And this is what reforms knowingness and consciousness, and allows its pure awareness, which is the same as the light of Ein Sof, one and the same, allows it to be known through the heart. It's the brain's transmutation that allows this new type of knowing to be known, and it's known throughout all things undifferentiatedly. And this undifferentiated state that is full of the heart's essence pouring and resonating out is known as the cardia plenum. Cardia meaning heart, plenum meaning full space, the heart full space, which encompasses infinity itself, both in whatever is known and the knowing of it. So since Dot is primarily concerned with brain activity, and since that conceptuality in Dot is where we get hung up as human beings, the brain transmutation has to be made first before that blessing force drops into the heart for our own efforts to rise and meet it. And this is very important. The brain has to change its view. Conceptuality has to become devalued, and transparent bliss clarity has to be made precious. This is a decisive leap that is made in a practitioner. It is the aspiration of the system. So to the extent that we can absorb through the intestines and think and feel with the kidneys, we raise our heart to that place where the transparent bliss clarity of a reborn mode of consciousness, pure awareness, can fall to meet it, and the heart can swirl and churn these impulses so that they're not separate from each other. So that which ascends and that which descends coalesce into a singular process, which is ultimately crystallized. And that crystallization is the aspiclaria, the point of the whole thing that I'm talking about here. Now, in this space where the crystallization and the meeting of these two vectors takes place, which I refer to as the cardia plenum, which we should really talk about quite a bit. When you look at the attribution of the organ system to this diagram, you see that that's where the lungs are located. That when the heart rises to transmute the brain, and the brain, having been transmuted, falls to meet the heart, the lungs are there in what would roughly correspond in our physical analog to the what do you call it? Cardiopulmonary complex, I guess you'd call it. And since the lungs are attributed to the etheric winds that blow through what we perceive as the structure of creation, what they do is create an exchange in and out of states of apparent containment, that the mind breathes itself through apparent form with the aspiration of transmuting it. So the rising of the fire in the heart, remember what we said about that last week, and the capacity for the brain to undergo this transformation is fueled by the lungs, kind of like if you've ever had a fireplace, particularly an old-fashioned fireplace, and you've used bellows to stoke the fire, that's what the lungs do. They stoke the flames and make it brighter, make it burn more intensely, to the extent that the etheric winds can engage this process and be drawn in actively. The fire in the heart grows brighter, and that which rises, rises, that which descends, descends to meet it, and the coalescence between them and the winds themselves become one continuous process. And when this is deeply felt and registered as a sensation, a meditative sensation that has no words for it, it's a heart fullness. And this is something you can only discover through your own practice. You can't discover it by anything that I could tell you. It's not contained within philosophy. This heart fullness is what is recognized, and the deeper and the greater the extent to which is recognized through all things is the extent to which contemplative immersion and absorption can actually happen in this heartful space. And I refer to it here in this diagram as an etheric cycling, which is very similar in our practice to the rotation that the electron chariot undergoes as it rotates around the central aleph of the heart, drawing increasing levels of depth and brightness and clarity. And that's where the skills of transparency that are sent up to Keter are learned and cultivated. That's your alchemical laboratory. And you have tools there, the fire, the air, and the ability to absorb and process the sparks of essentiality through your perceptual field. The whole of it, this whole tree, becomes an active process that is seated right in its midst, in the center. And the apex of this cardioplenum territory, if you want to use the designation of the Sphirot, is Yesod, as I said, rising up, and Tiferet, standing in the place where Dot once stood, coming down to meet it. And ultimately what happens in the crystallization of the Aspaklaria is that Tiferet and Yesod commingle with each other. And the crystallization is really the meeting of those two Sphirot and their vectoral dynamics converging into a singularity. And this is really important because you have to remember what these Sphirot represent. As I've said, Yesod represents the mind's eye, the power of visualization. What is it usually used for? Well, we have thinking and feeling in the ordinary sense, conceptualization in the ordinary sense, the chasing of desires in the ordinary sense, the running towards what we think will give us pleasure, and the running away from what gives us pain. So the visualization capacity of the average human being is generally, for the most part, for all conventionally fixated human beings, not very interested in the sublime attributes of wisdom, not very interested in visionary experience, but is instead bound to the body, mind, and its habit field exclusively. And this is the difference between the use of the mind's eye for ordinary concerns and the use of the mind's eye for mystical practice. In the ordinary sense, the mind's eye becomes the imagination. The imagination is an interesting term because a lot of esoteric practitioners and theorists use the term imagination and are referring to the mind's eye in the practice sense, and that's their use of the word. My use of the word imagination is not that. To me, the word imagination refers to conceptual associative patterns. In other words, the use of the mind's eye to innovate and problem solve and speculate that which is ordinary. And when this power of the mind's eye engages in this innovation, and a type of interior vision arises that veers into fantasy. Fantasy is the opposite of clarity and truth. Fantasy is an ordinary conceptual activity that the mind does to create solutions to its own problems. I would rather do this and not be doing that. It could be like this. It could be like that. There is something I'm interested in that I could see in my mind and change and shape and fashion and entertain myself with, to the positive or the negative, either something I want or something that I want to get away from. So it's always conceptual, and it's always going to reify its data. The imagination just always reifies something. If you took that power, that awesome power of the mind's eye, and sent it into a place where those habits of reification were not doing that ordinary activity, what an awesome power you would have at your disposal. And that's exactly what the heart raises in the form of this brilliance, this fire that is assimilated and digested with the intestines of Malkut, usurping the power of thought and feeling, which are purifying forces for that fire, those are the kidneys, and allows it to seat itself in the heart, to be sent into a place where no psyche goes, to stand in the place where the dot of the psyche used to be. And in that place, tremendous divine effulgence automatically, spontaneously is there to meet it, as I've mentioned. And this is where this etheric cycling opens up a whole new meaning and a whole new dimension for reality. And when that is sensed pervasively through the field of display, I refer to it as the cardia plenum.